They sold the beach house right under my feet. Not just sold, the auctioneer called the final bid, and my own son thanked the buyers, men who've been working for me all these years without ever once speaking a kind word. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share, and if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. Every morning I wake up in my tiny New York apartment on the Upper East Side, the city's distant hum creeping through the cracked window pane, the stale scent of old coffee lingering in the air. My fingers, more wrinkled now than I care to admit, trace the edges of a faded photograph I keep on my nightstand. It shows the beach house in Montauk, sunlight glinting off the Atlantic waves, the salt-whipped porch where I poured years of my love, my sweat, my dreams. The white shutters I painted myself every spring, the garden where I grew tomatoes and roses side by side. But now, it belongs to strangers. Men who never looked at me with anything but cold calculation in their eyes. I should start from the beginning, shouldn't I? My name is Margaret, and for 73 years I've called this earth home. For the last 45 of those years, I devoted everything to my family. Everything. I worked as a secretary at a law firm in Midtown Manhattan, taking the subway every morning at 6:30 sharp, my hands clutching a thermos of black coffee and a brown paper bag with my lunch inside. The job paid enough to keep us afloat, but barely. When Robert, my husband, died 15 years ago, I thought the world had ended. But I had my children. My son David, who was 35 then and already showing signs of the man he would become, sharp-tongued, impatient, always looking at me like I was a burden he had to carry. And my daughter Sarah, 2 years younger, who inherited her father's quiet demeanor, but somehow turned it cold. The beach house was my sanctuary. I bought it with my life insurance payout after Robert passed, plus every penny I had saved from 20 years of working double shifts. It was a small Cape Cod-style home, nothing fancy, but it sat on a bluff overlooking the ocean. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below could heal any heartache, I used to tell myself. I remember the first summer we all spent there together as a family without Robert. David brought his wife Jennifer and their twin boys, Michael and Jake, who were 8 years old then. Sarah came alone. She'd never married, said she preferred her independence. We grilled burgers on the deck, built sandcastles with the twins, watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Those were good days, days when I believed that love was enough to hold us together. But love, I've learned, is never enough when respect is missing. The first sign of trouble came 3 years later. David's construction business hit a rough patch. He came to me on a rainy Tuesday evening in October, his face drawn with worry, asking for $15,000 to keep his company afloat. "Mom, it's just temporary," he said, sitting at my kitchen table in the apartment I'd moved to after selling our family home in Queens. "I'll pay you back with interest once we get that contract in New Jersey." What could I say? He was my son, the father of my grandchildren. I withdrew the money from my retirement account and handed him the check without hesitation. He kissed my cheek and promised to pay me back by Christmas. Christmas came and went. So did the next 3 Christmases. The money was never mentioned again. When I brought it up once, David's jaw tightened. "Mom, you know how hard things have been. I'm doing my best." His voice carried that edge that made me feel small, like I was being unreasonable for expecting my own money back. Jennifer, stirring her coffee at the counter, didn't even look up. The twins were in the living room watching cartoons, oblivious to the tension hanging in the air like smoke. That became the pattern. David would come to me with his problems, and I would solve them. $20,000 for new equipment, $12,000 when Jennifer's mother got sick and they needed to help with medical bills, $8,000 for the twins' private school tuition. Each time he promised to pay me back. Each time, that promise dissolved like sugar in rain. Meanwhile, Sarah found her own ways to take advantage of my generosity. She was between jobs more often than not, claiming she couldn't find anything in her field. She'd studied art history in college, a degree that served her poorly in the practical world. She'd show up at my apartment with groceries, cooking elaborate meals that left my small kitchen destroyed, and somehow the conversation would always turn to her rent being due, or her car needing repairs, or some other crisis that required my immediate financial intervention. "You're the only one I can count on, Mom," she'd say, her eyes welling up with tears that may or may not have been real. I don't know what I'd do without you. I wanted to be needed. I wanted to matter. So I gave and gave and gave. The beach house became my refuge during those years. Every weekend from May through October, I'd take the train to Montauk, carrying bags of groceries and cleaning supplies. I'd spend my Saturdays scrubbing floors and washing windows, my Sundays reading on the porch and tending to my small garden. Sometimes David's boys would visit, and we'd walk along the beach collecting shells and building driftwood forts. Those moments made everything else worthwhile. But even the house required constant attention and money I increasingly didn't have. The roof started leaking during a nor'easter in 2018. I climbed up there myself with a tarp and some nails, my 70-year-old body protesting every step up the ladder. The heating system failed that winter, leaving the pipes frozen and burst by spring. I took out a small loan against the house to pay for the repairs, telling myself it was an investment. David offered to help with the maintenance, but his idea of help involved bringing his crew out for weekend projects that somehow always required expensive materials I had to pay for up front. "Don't worry, Mom," he'd say. "We'll settle up later." Later never came. Instead, I'd get bills from the lumber yard and the hardware store, invoices with David's company heading but my name as the responsible party. The workers he brought were men from his construction company, rough-faced guys who spoke in grunts and looked at me like I was in their way. There was Pete, a large man with calloused hands who never said hello or goodbye. There was Miguel, younger but equally silent, who tracked mud through my house without apology. And there was Tom, the foreman, who had a way of shaking his head whenever I suggested something, as if my ideas were too foolish to consider. They knew every corner of my house, every weakness in its foundation. They'd been inside when I wasn't there, had keys I'd given to David for emergencies. They knew it better than I did, in some ways. I should have seen the signs. I should have questioned why David was suddenly so interested in the house's structural details, why he asked so many questions about the property taxes and the mortgage. But I was tired, so very tired of being suspicious of the people I loved most. My 72nd birthday came and went without a card from either of my children. Not even a phone call. I sat alone in my Manhattan apartment, looking at the photograph of the beach house, wondering what I had done wrong. The silence felt heavier than any argument would have. 2 weeks later, David called. Not to apologize for missing my birthday, but to tell me he'd been researching the real estate market in Montauk. "Mom, do you know what that house is worth now?" His voice was excited, almost breathless. "The market's crazy out there. Properties like yours are selling for $600,000 or $700,000. My heart sank as the implication hit me. "Are you suggesting I sell?" "I'm just saying, you're sitting on a gold mine, and you're always worried about money. Maybe it's time to be practical." Practical. As if the house was just an investment, not the place where his children had learned to swim, where we'd held Robert's memorial service, where I'd planned to spend my final years watching the ocean that had always calmed my soul. "I'm not ready to sell," I said quietly. The line went silent for a long moment. Then David's voice returned, cooler now. "Well, you can't afford to keep it much longer anyway. The property taxes alone are killing you." He was right about the taxes. They'd doubled in the last 5 years as Montauk became more popular with wealthy New Yorkers looking for weekend retreats. But hearing him say it felt like a punch to the chest. My own son was basically telling me I was too poor to keep the home I loved. That night I called Sarah, hoping for some sympathy. Instead, she sided with her brother. Mom, David has a point. You're 72 years old. What do you need with a beach house? You could sell it, move somewhere smaller and cheaper, maybe even closer to us. Closer to you, I thought bitterly. So you can take what little I have left more easily. I'm not selling, I told her firmly. Both of them stopped calling after that. The silence stretched through the spring and into summer. I spent those months alone at the beach house, trying to repair what I could myself, watching the sunset from my porch every evening, and wondering if I was being stubborn or just scared. In July, David showed up unexpectedly with the twins, now 15 and driving with learner's permits. They were polite but distant, glued to their phones, clearly uncomfortable with the tension between their father and me. David acted like nothing had happened, grilling hot dogs and making small talk about the weather. But I caught him taking pictures of the house from different angles, making notes on his phone about things that needed fixing. The deck is rotting, he observed, pressing his foot against a loose board. And those windows need to be replaced before winter. I nodded, knowing he was right, but also knowing I couldn't afford major repairs. My savings were nearly gone after years of supporting him and Sarah. My Social Security barely covered my apartment rent and basic expenses. That's when David made his move. Coming up behind me as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, he placed his hands on my shoulders, a gesture that once would have felt affectionate, but now felt manipulative. Mom, I've been thinking. What if I helped you manage the house? I could handle the repairs, maybe rent it out during peak season to help with expenses. We could split the rental income. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like help. But something in his tone made my stomach clench with unease. I don't want strangers in the house, I said. They wouldn't be strangers. I'd screen them carefully, and it's only temporary until you decide what you want to do long term. I should have said no. I should have trusted my instincts. Instead, I nodded, desperate for any solution that would let me keep the house without drowning in debt. The paperwork David brought me a week later was thick and confusing. It's just a management agreement, he explained, sitting at my kitchen table while I struggled to read the small print. It gives me authority to handle repairs and rentals. Everything else stays the same. I signed it because I trusted him, because he was my son, because I wanted to believe he had my best interests at heart. The changes started immediately. David had new locks installed, explaining that rental properties needed better security. He hired a cleaning service that came twice a week, whether I was there or not. When I arrived for my usual weekend visits, I'd find things rearranged, personal items moved or missing entirely. The renters need space for their stuff, David explained when I asked about the missing photographs from the mantelpiece. Don't worry, everything's packed safely in the garage. But when I checked the garage, I found boxes labeled Salvation Army filled with my belongings, my mother's china, Robert's fishing tackle, the hand-knitted Afghans I'd made during lonely winter evenings. All of it deemed unworthy of keeping by my own son. The rental income David promised never materialized. When I asked about it, he showed me receipts for repairs and improvements that seemed to eat up every penny. New appliances I hadn't requested, expensive landscaping that transformed my wild beach garden into something sterile and magazine-perfect, paint jobs that covered the soft yellows and blues I loved with stark whites and grays. We have to keep up with market standards, David explained when I protested. These improvements will increase the property value. But it wasn't my house anymore. It was becoming something cold and unfamiliar, designed to appeal to strangers with money instead of a family with memories. The final blow came on a Tuesday in September. I'd taken the train out for what I thought would be a peaceful afternoon, wanting to sit on the porch and watch the autumn light dance on the water. Instead, I found the house full of people I didn't recognize. Men in suits with clipboards, walking through my home like they owned it, measuring rooms and taking pictures. "Excuse me," I said to one of them, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses. "What are you doing in my house?" He looked confused. "Your house? I thought this was the Morrison property." Morrison was David's last name. My maiden name was Sullivan, and I'd kept it after Robert died. That's when I noticed Pete, Miguel, and Tom standing in the corner of the living room, talking quietly among themselves. The same men who'd been doing repairs for David all these years. The same men who'd never acknowledged me as anything more than an obstacle to their work. My hand started shaking. I fumbled for my phone and called David. "What's going on at the house?" I demanded when he answered. There was a long pause. Then he sighed. "Mom, we need to talk. Can you come to my office tomorrow? I want to know what's happening right now." Another pause. "I'm putting the house up for auction. The management agreement gives me the authority to make decisions about the property, and frankly, the expenses are getting out of control." The world tilted. I grabbed the kitchen counter to steady myself. "You can't sell my house. Mom, be reasonable. You can't afford to keep it, and I can't keep pouring money into repairs. This way, we'll get top dollar, and you'll have enough to live comfortably." Comfortably. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor. "I never agreed to sell," I whispered. "You signed the management agreement. I have full authority to make financial decisions regarding the property." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my apartment reading and rereading the papers I'd signed, trying to understand how I'd given away my home without realizing it. The legal language was deliberately confusing, designed to hide the true implications. My son had tricked me into signing away my rights to the only thing I had left that mattered. I called a lawyer the next morning, a young woman named Amanda Chen who worked at a legal aid office near Brooklyn Bridge. She looked over the papers with a frown. "This is a very broad power of attorney agreement," she said. "Unfortunately, it does give your son authority to sell the property if he can demonstrate financial necessity." "But it's my house." "According to this, you've also made him co-owner through what's called a survivorship deed. Did you understand that when you signed?" I hadn't understood any of it. I'd signed because I trusted my son. Amanda was kind but realistic. "We can try to challenge this, but it will take time and money. The auction is scheduled for next week?" I nodded, feeling sick. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Sullivan. Your son has been very thorough." The auction was held on a crisp October Saturday. I took the train to Montauk one last time, my heart breaking with every mile. The house looked beautiful in the morning light, the improvements David had made creating perfect curb appeal. Cars lined the narrow street, and people in expensive clothes walked through my home like it was a museum exhibit. I stood at the edge of the crowd, invisible in my old wool coat, watching strangers bid on my life. The auctioneer was a loud man with a microphone, calling out numbers that climbed higher and higher. 600,000, 700,000, 800,000. And there was David, standing near the front, nodding approvingly as the numbers climbed. He looked handsome in his dark suit, every inch the successful businessman. My successful son, selling his mother's heart for profit. When the bidding ended at $850,000, I watched in numb shock as the winning bidders approached David to shake hands. It was Pete, Miguel, and Tom, the same construction workers who'd been repairing my house for years. The same men who'd looked through me like I was invisible, who'd tracked mud through my kitchen, who'd never once treated me with basic human courtesy. They were buying my house. With what money? I couldn't imagine, but somehow they'd managed to outbid wealthy Manhattan weekenders and real estate developers. David thanked them warmly, like they were old friends instead of employees. "Pleasure doing business with you guys," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a real auction, it was theater. David had arranged for his own workers to be the highest bidders, probably with money he was loaning them or some other arrangement. He was selling my house to people he controlled, ensuring he could continue to profit from it somehow. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run up to that microphone and tell everyone what was happening. But what could I say? That my son had legally stolen my house? That the auction was a sham? I had no proof, just a broken heart and a terrible understanding of how thoroughly I'd been betrayed. Instead, I turned and walked away, my footsteps silent on the gravel driveway. Behind me, I could hear David's voice rising above the crowd, talking about settlement dates and inspections. The sound of laughter drifted from the porch where strangers were already making plans for my former sanctuary. On the train ride back to Manhattan, I stared out the window at the Long Island landscape rushing past. Suburban homes with neat yards where other families lived their lives. Strip malls and gas stations and all the ordinary places that make up a world I no longer felt part of. I kept thinking about the photograph on my nightstand, wondering if I should throw it away now that the house was gone. But I didn't throw it away. Instead, I placed it face down in the drawer next to my bed and tried to pretend I could forget. The money from the sale came 3 weeks later. David deposited it directly into my bank account, $425,000, exactly half of what the house had sold for. The other half, he explained in a brief phone call, went to covering the management expenses and his commission as the sale agent. "You should be happy, Mom," he said. "This is more money than you've ever had at one time." He was right. It was a lot of money, enough to live comfortably for years, maybe even move somewhere nice. But money couldn't replace what I'd lost, not just the house, but my faith in my son, my belief that family meant something more than profit and loss. Sarah called that evening, her voice bright with artificial cheer. "Mom, David told me about the sale. Congratulations. Now you can stop worrying about money and start enjoying life." "I didn't want to sell," I said quietly. "Oh, Mom, you'll see. This is for the best. You were getting too attached to that old place anyway." Too attached. As if loving your home was a character flaw instead of something natural and human. Both of my children seemed to expect gratitude for what they'd done to me. They'd solved my problems, taken care of my future, made difficult decisions so I wouldn't have to. In their minds, they were heroes. They couldn't understand why I felt broken instead of relieved. The weeks that followed were the darkest of my life. I found myself walking the streets of Manhattan aimlessly, looking in shop windows without seeing anything, sitting on park benches watching other people's lives unfold. The city that had been my home for decades suddenly felt foreign and hostile. Every sound was too loud. Every face was a stranger's. Every moment stretched endlessly toward a future I couldn't imagine wanting. My neighbor Evelyn knocked on my door one evening in November, concerned because she hadn't seen me in days. She was a retired schoolteacher, a widow like me, but somehow more at peace with her circumstances. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled, and she had a way of looking at you that made you feel heard. "Margaret, honey, you look terrible," she said, settling into my kitchen chair without waiting for an invitation. "When's the last time you ate a real meal?" I couldn't remember. Food had lost its taste since the auction. Everything tasted like cardboard soaked in sadness. Evelyn made tea and opened a tin of cookies she'd brought from her apartment across the hall. For a long time, we sat in comfortable silence, sipping Earl Grey and watching the November rain streak down my window. "You want to talk about it?" she finally asked. So I told her everything. About the years of giving money I couldn't afford. About signing papers I didn't understand. About watching my house sold to men who'd never shown me a moment of kindness. About my children's cold dismissal of my pain. Evelyn listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret," she said finally, "you raised some ungrateful children." The bluntness of it made me gasp. No one had ever said it out loud before. "But that doesn't mean you're worthless," she continued. It means they don't recognize value when they see it. I started crying then. Not the silent tears I'd been shedding for weeks, but loud, ugly sobs that came from somewhere deep inside my chest. Evelyn moved her chair closer and held my hand while I cried out years of accumulated hurt. "What do I do now?" I asked when the tears finally stopped. "You stop giving them power over your happiness," she said simply. "You stop waiting for them to love you the way you love them, and you start living for yourself." It sounded impossible. At 73, how do you learn to stop being a mother? How do you turn off the part of your heart that would still do anything for your children, even after they've broken it? But Evelyn planted a seed that day. The idea that my worth wasn't determined by how much my children valued me, that I could choose to stop being their victim. Christmas came and went without calls from David or Sarah. I spent the day with Evelyn, sharing a small turkey and watching old movies. It wasn't the family celebration I'd always dreamed of, but it wasn't unbearable either. For the first time in months, I felt something approaching peace. In January, David called to discuss our finances. My finances, really, but he'd appointed himself as my advisor since I clearly couldn't be trusted to make good decisions. "Mom, you need to invest this money wisely," he said. "I've been talking to a financial planner, and we think—" "I don't need your help," I interrupted. There was a pause. "What?" "I said I don't need your help. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own money." "Mom, be reasonable. You've never had this much money before. You don't understand the complexities of investment planning." The condescension in his voice was like a slap. I thought of all the years I'd managed our household budget while his father drank his way through job after job. All the times I'd juggled bills and stretched dollars to make sure David and Sarah had what they needed. I'd been managing money just fine before they were born. "I understand enough," I said calmly. "And I've decided I won't be needing your advice anymore." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm done. Done being your personal bank. Done being treated like I'm too stupid to make my own decisions. Done being disrespected by my own children." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Then his voice returned, harder now. "Mom, I think you're having some kind of breakdown. Maybe Sarah and I need to look into getting you some help. Someone to manage your affairs if you're not capable." I hung up on him. My hands were shaking, but I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. The power of saying no. He called back immediately. I didn't answer. He called again an hour later. Still didn't answer. By evening, my voicemail was full of increasingly angry messages from both David and Sarah, demanding that I call them back, accusing me of being manipulated by outsiders, threatening to have me declared incompetent if I didn't start acting rationally. I deleted every message without listening to them completely. Then I changed my phone number. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. For the first time in decades, I wasn't worried about someone calling to ask for money or help or emotional labor I couldn't afford to give. But I was also completely alone in a way I'd never been before. Evelyn helped me through those first weeks. She brought me groceries when I was too anxious to leave my apartment. She sat with me in the evenings when the silence felt too heavy. She listened when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was being cruel or unreasonable or crazy. "You're not crazy," she assured me one snowy February evening as we watched the city transform into something beautiful and clean. "You're just finally standing up for yourself. It feels strange because you've never done it before." She was right. I'd spent so many years being what other people needed, a devoted wife, a sacrificing mother, a reliable source of financial and emotional support, that I'd forgotten who I was underneath all those roles. In March, I started therapy with a counselor Evelyn recommended. Dr. Patricia Waters was a woman about my age who specialized in late-life transitions. Her office was in a brownstone near Central Park, filled with plants and soft lighting that made difficult conversations feel safer. Tell me about your relationship with your children, she said during our first session. It took 3 full sessions just to get through the basic story. Dr. Waters listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that helped me see patterns I'd been blind to. Margaret, you seem to have confused love with financial support, she observed. Do you think it's possible to love someone without giving them money? The question hit me like cold water. Of course it was possible, but I'd gotten so used to buying affection, to proving my worth through my willingness to sacrifice, that I'd forgotten love could exist without transactions. My children think I'm being selfish, I told her. What do you think? I think maybe selfish isn't always wrong. Maybe sometimes you have to be selfish to survive. Dr. Waters smiled. It was the first time anyone had smiled when I talked about choosing myself over my children. The work was hard. 40+ years of people-pleasing doesn't disappear overnight. I had to learn to recognize the difference between guilt and genuine remorse, between love and manipulation, between helping and enabling. I had to forgive myself for all the years I'd let them take advantage of me, and I had to accept that they might never forgive me for finally standing up for myself. But slowly, something inside me began to shift. The constant anxiety that had lived in my chest for years began to loosen. I started sleeping better. Food began to taste good again. I bought a small easel and some paints, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was constantly solving everyone else's problems. My first painting was terrible, a muddy landscape that looked like a child's finger painting. But something about the feel of the brush in my hand, the way the colors blended and surprised me, felt like coming home to myself. In April, I joined a painting class at the community center near Lincoln Center. The other students were mostly retirees like me, people who'd raised families and worked jobs and were finally doing something just for the joy of it. There was Harold, a former accountant who painted delicate watercolor birds. There was Rita, a nurse who created bold, abstract pieces full of energy and color. There was Frank, a widower who'd started painting portraits of his late wife and discovered a talent that amazed everyone, including himself. Nobody asked about my children. Nobody expected me to be anything other than Margaret, a woman learning to paint. For 2 hours every Thursday morning, I wasn't a mother or a grandmother or a victim. I was just someone trying to capture light on canvas. The instructor was a young woman named Amy, who had endless patience for our clumsy attempts at art. She taught us about color theory and composition, but more importantly, she taught us to see beauty in imperfection. Art isn't about making something perfect, she said one morning while I struggled with a still life of fruit. It's about expressing something true. What was true for me was pain, but also healing. Loneliness, but also freedom. Loss, but also discovery. I started painting darker pieces. Storm clouds over empty beaches, bare trees against winter skies, lone figures walking through city streets. They weren't pretty, but they were honest. In May, David showed up at my building. I was coming back from grocery shopping when I saw him in the lobby, talking to the doorman. My heart stopped. For a moment, I considered turning around and walking away, but he'd already seen me. Mom. His voice was different, softer, younger somehow. Can we talk? I looked at him carefully. He'd lost weight, and there were new lines around his eyes. For just a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. How did you find me? Sarah hired a private investigator. We've been worried about you. Worried about me, or worried about the money? I let him come up to my apartment, but I didn't offer him coffee or ask him to sit down. We stood in my small living room like polite strangers. Mom, I think we got off on the wrong foot, he began. Maybe I could have handled things differently with the house. You stole my house, I said quietly. His face reddened. I didn't steal anything. I saved you from financial ruin. Do you have any idea how much that place was costing you? The taxes alone were $15,000 a year. It was my house, my decision to make. You weren't making decisions. You were just sinking deeper into debt while refusing to face reality. The same old David, I realized. Still convinced he knew what was best for everyone else. Still unable to hear anything that challenged his version of events. "What do you want?" I asked. "I want my mother back." "Sarah and I both do. The boys ask about you. They don't understand why you've cut us off." The mention of my grandsons made my chest ache. Michael and Jake were 17 now, probably preparing for college. I'd missed their junior year of high school, missed seeing them grow from children into young men. "You can see them anytime," David continued, sensing my weakness. "But this has to stop. This anger, this stubbornness. We're family. Family." He said it like it was a magic word that could erase years of being treated like an ATM with legs. "David," I said carefully, "do you think you've done anything wrong?" He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "Wrong? Mom, everything I did was for your own good. I protected you from making terrible financial decisions. I made sure you got the best possible price for the house. I've been trying to help you invest wisely. How is any of that wrong?" There it was. He genuinely believed he was the hero of this story. In his mind, I was an incompetent old woman who needed to be managed, and he was the dutiful son who'd taken on that burden. "I want you to leave," I said. "Mom, I want you to leave, and I don't want you to come back unless you can apologize for selling my house without my permission, and acknowledge that I have the right to make my own decisions, even if they're mistakes." His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally, contempt. "Fine," he said. "When you come to your senses, you know where to find me. But don't expect us to keep waiting forever. Sarah and I have our own lives to live." After he left, I sat on my couch and cried, not for him, but for the son I'd thought I had. The one who would put my happiness above his convenience, who would love me enough to admit when he was wrong, who would see me as a person instead of a problem to be solved. That evening, I called Dr. Waters and scheduled an extra session. "How do you feel about what happened?" she asked. "Sad, but also proud? Is that wrong?" "Why would it be wrong to be proud of standing up for yourself?" "Because he's my son. Because maybe I am being stubborn and unreasonable." "Margaret, let me ask you something. If a friend told you that her son had tricked her into signing away her house and then sold it without her permission, what would you say to her?" I thought about it. I'd be furious on her behalf. I'd tell her she deserved better. But when it's you, you wonder if you're being unreasonable. The double standard was clear when she put it like that. I was holding myself to a different, harsher standard than I would anyone else. Summer came, and with it a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. I took longer walks through Central Park, noticing things I'd been too worried or distracted to see before. Street musicians and flower vendors, couples holding hands on benches, children feeding ducks at the pond. The ordinary magic of a city full of people living their lives. I started volunteering at a literacy program in the Bronx, helping adults learn to read. Many of my students were immigrants, people who'd left everything behind to build new lives in America. Their courage inspired me. If they could start over in a foreign country with nothing but hope and determination, surely I could figure out how to live without my children's approval. One of my students was a woman named Carmen from El Salvador. She was about my age, a grandmother who'd followed her daughter to New York after her husband died. She was learning English so she could help her grandchildren with their homework. "In my country, I was a teacher," she told me one afternoon as we worked on reading comprehension. "Here, I clean offices at night. But I don't mind. I have my family close, and every day I learn something new." Her gratitude for small things shamed me. Here I was, mourning the loss of children who'd treated me poorly, while Carmen celebrated the chance to share a tiny apartment with people who valued her presence. "You have children?" she asked me during a break. "2," I said carefully. "But we don't speak anymore." She looked puzzled. "They live far away?" "No, they live here in the city. We had a disagreement." Carmen studied my face with the wisdom of someone who'd lived through real hardship. "Sometimes," she said, "the people we love most are the ones who hurt us most. But love doesn't die, even when it should." She was right. I still loved David and Sarah, despite everything. But I was beginning to understand that loving someone doesn't mean accepting their mistreatment. It doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity to avoid conflict. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses. In August, I took a trip to Maine. It was the first vacation I'd taken in 15 years that wasn't about visiting family or maintaining the beach house. I rented a small cabin near Acadia National Park and spent a week hiking gentle trails, painting watercolors of the rocky coastline, and reading books I'd bought just because they interested me. One evening, I was sitting on the cabin's porch writing postcards to Evelyn and my painting classmates when my phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. "Mom?" Her voice was shaky, younger than usual. "I need to talk to you." My first instinct was to ask what was wrong, to offer help, to slip back into the old patterns, but I'd learned to pause before reacting. "I'm listening," I said carefully. "I lost my job last week. The art gallery closed, and I can't find anything else. My rent is due, and I don't know what to do." The old Margaret would have offered money immediately. This Margaret waited. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "That must be very stressful." "Mom, I need help, just until I find something new. Maybe a couple $1,000 to cover rent and groceries." There it was. Not an apology for months of silence. Not an acknowledgement of the pain they'd caused me. Just another request for money, as if nothing had changed. "Sarah," I said slowly, "the last time we spoke, you told me I was too attached to my old house and needed to stop being emotional about money. Do you remember that?" A pause. "That's different." "How is it different?" "Because I'm in crisis. I really need help. And I really needed my house. But you supported David when he sold it out from under me." I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, probably trying to figure out how to manipulate the conversation back to her advantage. "Mom, that was a business decision. David was trying to protect your future. This is just about survival." Still no acknowledgement of my feelings. Still no recognition that I might have had legitimate reasons for being upset. "Sarah, I love you, but I'm not going to give you money." The explosion was immediate. "I can't believe you're being so selfish. I'm your daughter. I'm in trouble and you're punishing me because you're still angry about a house you couldn't afford anyway." Her words stung, but they also clarified something for me. This was how she saw me, as a resource to be tapped when convenient, dismissed when not needed. My feelings were irrelevant. My needs were secondary. I existed to solve their problems. "I hope you figure things out," I said calmly, "but I won't be helping you financially." "Fine," she screamed. "Don't come crying to us when you're old and sick and need someone to take care of you." She hung up before I could respond. I sat on the porch in the gathering dusk, listening to loons calling across the lake, processing what she'd said. The threat was clear. Love me conditionally or risk abandonment when I'm most vulnerable. But hadn't they already abandoned me when I needed them most? When I was grieving the loss of my sanctuary? When I was trying to understand how I'd lost everything I'd worked for? When I was struggling with the betrayal of people I'd trusted completely? The Maine night was peaceful around me. Stars appeared one by one in the clear sky. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the ocean waves that had always comforted me. I realized that I wasn't afraid of Sarah's threat anymore. I'd been living without their care for months now, and I was not only surviving but actually thriving. The next morning, I extended my stay in Maine for another week. I wasn't ready to go back to the city, back to the complicated emotions that lived in my apartment, along with the memories. Instead, I drove along the coast, stopping at small towns and painting seascapes that captured something I'd never been able to express before: joy mixed with solitude, strength born from abandonment. In a gallery in Bar Harbor, I saw a painting that stopped me in my tracks. It showed an elderly woman standing alone on a cliff overlooking the ocean. Her gray hair was whipping in the wind, her simple dress pressed against her body by the gusts. But there was something powerful in her posture, something defiant and free. The title was Finally. I stood there for 20 minutes, seeing myself in that painted woman. Finally free. Finally strong. Finally living for myself instead of for other people's expectations. When I returned to New York in September, I felt different. Lighter somehow, but also more solid. More present in my own life. Evelyn noticed immediately. "You look wonderful," she said over tea in my kitchen. "What happened in Maine?" I told her about Sarah's call, about the threat, about standing on the gallery looking at that painting. "And how do you feel about it all?" "Free," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "For the first time in my adult life, I feel free." That fall, I made changes I'd been thinking about for months. I moved to a larger apartment in a building near the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It had tall windows that let in afternoon light perfect for painting, and a small balcony where I could grow herbs and flowers. The rent was higher, but I could afford it now. The money from the beach house sale, invested carefully with the help of a financial advisor I'd chosen myself, was generating enough income to live comfortably. I furnished the apartment with things I actually liked instead of hand-me-downs and inherited pieces that carried other people's memories. A comfortable reading chair in soft blue velvet. A dining table for 4, instead of the massive one I'd kept for family gatherings that never happened. Paintings on the walls, not masterpieces, but pieces that spoke to me, including 2 of my own watercolors that Amy had encouraged me to frame. I joined a book club that met at the library near my old apartment. The group was mostly women my age, but also a few men and some younger people who just loved reading. We met monthly to discuss everything from literary fiction to memoirs to mysteries. Our conversations ranged far beyond books: politics, travel, family, aging, dreams deferred and dreams discovered late in life. Nobody in the group knew about my estrangement from my children unless I chose to share it. I was just Margaret, a woman who painted and read and had opinions about Virginia Woolf's stream of consciousness technique. It was liberating to exist without the weight of my maternal failures and disappointments. In October, I got a call from Michael, one of my grandsons. He was 18 now, a senior in high school, and his voice on the phone was deeper than I remembered. "Grandma? It's Michael." My heart clenched. I hadn't heard from either of the twins since David's visit in May. "Michael, how wonderful to hear from you. I got your new number from the school counselor. You'd listed her as an emergency contact, remember?" I did remember. Back when the boys were younger and I was still part of their lives, I'd filled out forms and attended parent-teacher conferences when David and Jennifer were too busy. "I'm calling because I'm applying to colleges and I need some information for the financial aid forms. But also, I wanted to ask you something." "What is it, sweetheart?" "Why don't you come to family things anymore? Dad says you're going through some kind of phase, but Jake and I miss you." The directness of the question caught me off guard. How do you explain to your 18-year-old grandson that his father stole your house? That his family sees you as a bank account with a pulse? It's complicated, Michael. Your father and I have some disagreements about how family members should treat each other. Is it about money? Because Jake and I don't care about that stuff. We just want our grandmother back." The longing in his voice nearly broke my resolve. These boys had done nothing wrong. They were innocent victims of their parents' greed and my belated self-respect. "Can I see you?" I asked. "Maybe we could have lunch, just the two of us?" "Yeah, I'd like that. But could you maybe not tell Dad? He's been pretty angry about everything, and I don't want to make it worse." The fact that my grandson felt he had to sneak around to see me was heartbreaking, but it was also revealing. David was controlling the narrative, making me the villain in a story where I was actually the victim. We met the following Saturday at a small cafe near Columbia University, where Michael was hoping to study engineering. He was tall now, taller than his father, with Robert's gentle eyes and my stubborn chin. Seeing him was like looking at echoes of people I'd loved. "Tell me about college applications," I said, wanting to focus on his future rather than our family's dysfunction. His face lit up as he talked about his plans, his dreams of studying renewable energy engineering, his hope to make a difference in the fight against climate change. He was passionate and idealistic in the way only 18-year-olds can be, and listening to him reminded me why I'd fallen in love with being a grandmother in the first place. "Columbia is my first choice," he said, "but the tuition is crazy expensive. Dad says I should go to a state school and stop dreaming so big." My heart sank. David's practical, narrow worldview was already limiting his son's possibilities. "What about financial aid?" I asked. "That's the thing. Dad makes too much money for need-based aid, but he says he can't afford to help with tuition, so I'm stuck in the middle." I thought about the $400,000 sitting in my investment account, money that had come from selling my dreams. Maybe it could buy someone else's dreams instead. "Michael," I said carefully, "if you get into Columbia, I want you to know that your education will be taken care of." His eyes widened. "Grandma, I can't let you—" "You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing to do it. This is how I want to spend my money." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Why are you being so nice to me when my family has been so awful to you?" The question pierced my heart because it confirmed what I'd suspected. The boys knew about the tension, knew their father had done something wrong, even if they didn't know the details. "Because you're not responsible for your parents' choices," I said. "And because I love you. That hasn't changed." We spent the rest of lunch talking about his classes, his girlfriend, his part-time job at a local restaurant. Normal grandfather-grandson conversation that felt like a lifeline to the person I used to be. When we parted, he hugged me tightly. "Thank you, Grandma, for everything." That evening, I called the financial aid office at Columbia and set up an account to cover Michael's tuition and expenses. If he got in, he wouldn't have to worry about money. He could focus on learning and growing and becoming the man he was meant to be. Word of my promise to Michael spread quickly through the family. David called me the next week, his voice tight with anger. "You have no right to interfere with how we're raising our children," he said without preamble. "I'm not interfering. I'm offering to help my grandson get an education. By going behind our backs and making promises you can't keep. I can keep them. And I went behind your back because you've made it clear that I'm not welcome in your lives unless I'm handing over money with no questions asked. That's not... Mom, this isn't about money, isn't it? Because every conversation we've had for the past 5 years has ended with someone asking me to write a check." Silence on his end. He couldn't deny it because it was true. "Look," he said finally, his voice softer. "Maybe we can work something out. Jennifer and I have been talking, and we think maybe we were too hasty about the house thing. Maybe there's a way to make it right." My heart skipped a beat despite myself. Was he actually going to apologize? Was there a chance for reconciliation? "What do you mean?" "Well, the guys who bought the house. They're having some financial difficulties. Pete lost his construction license, and they can't keep up with the mortgage payments. We might be able to buy it back for you, at a discount." There it was. Not an apology, but another scheme. Another way to manipulate me into giving them money while making it seem like they were doing me a favor. "Why would you do that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Because you're our mother, and we want you to be happy. All we'd need is maybe $300,000 to make it happen. As an investment, obviously. You'd get the house back and we'd handle all the management details." The audacity took my breath away. They wanted me to pay for my own house twice, and they still wanted to control it. "David," I said quietly, "do you think I'm stupid?" "What?" "No, of course not." "Because that's how you're treating me. Like I'm too stupid to see what you're really doing." "Mom, I don't know what you mean. You're trying to trick me into giving you money to buy back the house you stole from me, a house you sold to your own employees in a fake auction. Do you really think I don't understand what happened?" The silence stretched for so long I thought he'd hung up. When he spoke again, his voice was cold and hard. "You're being paranoid and unreasonable. Sarah's right. You need professional help. Maybe it's time to look into assisted living facilities, somewhere they can make sure you're taking your medication and not making irrational decisions." The threat was clear. If I didn't play along with their schemes, they'd try to have me declared incompetent and take control of all my money. "Goodbye, David," I said calmly, and hung up. That night, I called Amanda Chen, the lawyer who'd helped me understand the documents I'd signed. I needed to protect myself legally from any attempt by my children to claim I was mentally incompetent. "It's not uncommon," she assured me. "Adult children sometimes try to gain conservatorship over parents who won't give them money. But you're clearly competent, and we can take steps to protect your assets and your autonomy." We spent an hour going over my options: living will, healthcare directive, financial power of attorney to someone other than my children, legal documentation that would make it very difficult for David and Sarah to interfere with my life or my money. "I have one more question," I said as we wrapped up our meeting. "Is there any way to reverse what happened with the beach house, if the sale was fraudulent?" Amanda looked thoughtful. "It would be difficult and expensive to prove fraud. But if you can demonstrate that the auction was a sham, that the buyers were working in collusion with your son, there might be grounds for a lawsuit." She gave me the name of a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud. I hired him that same week. The investigation took 3 months and cost me $15,000, but it was worth every penny for what it uncovered. Pete, Miguel, and Tom hadn't bought my house with their own money. David had arranged financing through his construction company, essentially lending them the purchase price in exchange for a significant share of the ownership. They were fronts, puppets in an elaborate scheme to steal my house while maintaining the appearance of a legal sale. Even more damaging, the investigator found evidence that David had been planning the theft for months. Email exchanges discussing the problem of my attachment to the house, text messages about setting up the fake auction, bank records showing money moving between David's accounts and the supposed buyers. I had enough evidence to not only prove fraud, but potentially pursue criminal charges. Amanda was excited when I brought her the investigator's report. "This is solid," she said. "We can demand return of the property and damages for the fraudulent sale." But I surprised her with my decision. "I don't want the house back," I said. "What? Why not?" I thought about it for a moment, trying to articulate something I was just beginning to understand myself. The house was just a building. What mattered to me was the family memories it held, the feeling of belonging somewhere. But those memories were poisoned when my children betrayed me. Even if I got it back, it wouldn't be the same. What I wanted instead was justice and closure. We filed a civil lawsuit against David, demanding monetary damages for the fraudulent sale. I also provided all the evidence to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. The legal papers were served on a Tuesday in March. David called me within hours, his voice shaking with rage. "How could you do this to your own son? I could go to jail." "You committed fraud," I replied calmly. "Actions have consequences." "I was trying to help you." "You were trying to help yourself to my money. There's a difference." "Mom, please. Think about what you're doing. Think about the boys. If I go to prison, what happens to them?" It was emotional blackmail of the worst kind, using my love for my grandsons to protect himself from the consequences of his choices. But I'd learned to recognize manipulation when I saw it. "You should have thought about the boys before you decided to steal from their grandmother," I said, and hung up. The legal process moved slowly, but I was patient. I'd waited 73 years to stand up for myself. I could wait a few more months for justice. Meanwhile, my life continued to improve. I'd started taking Italian lessons at the community college, planning a trip to Tuscany in the spring. My painting had progressed enough that Amy suggested I submit some pieces to a group show at a gallery in Soho. I'd joined a hiking group that explored trails in the Hudson Valley on weekends. For the first time since Robert died, I had a social life that didn't revolve around family obligations. Evelyn and I went to Broadway shows and museum exhibitions. Rita from my painting class introduced me to her book club, where we discussed novels I'd never had time to read when I was constantly worrying about other people's problems. Harold invited me to a classical music concert at Lincoln Center, and we discovered we both loved Vivaldi. I wasn't dating. At my age, the prospect seemed more exhausting than appealing, but I was forming friendships based on mutual interests rather than family duty or geographical proximity. These people liked my company. They valued my opinions. They treated me with respect and kindness. In April, Michael called to tell me he'd been accepted to Columbia with a partial academic scholarship. Between that and the fund I'd established, his education was completely covered. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "Just do well and be happy," I replied. "That's all the thanks I need." "Can I ask you something, Grandma?" "Of course." Are you ever going to forgive Dad?" It was a question I'd been asking myself for months. I still loved David and Sarah, despite everything. Love isn't something you can turn off like a faucet. But forgiveness requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing, genuine remorse, and a commitment to change. None of those things had happened. "I don't know," I told Michael honestly. Forgiveness isn't something you do once and then it's finished. It's a process, and it requires two people. Your father would have to admit he did something wrong first. He's not going to do that, is he? Probably not. Michael was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm sorry he hurt you." Those words meant more to me than any apology from David ever could. My grandson saw the truth and validated my pain. That was enough. The lawsuit was settled out of court in June. David agreed to pay me $500,000 in damages, more than the house had been worth, in exchange for dropping the criminal charges. He also had to publicly admit to fraud in court documents, though he managed to avoid jail time. Sarah called me after the settlement was finalized, her voice smaller than I'd heard it since she was a child. "Mom, I heard about the lawsuit." "Yes." "I wanted you to know. I didn't know about David's plan." I supported selling the house because I thought it was the right thing financially, but I didn't know it was what it was. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd heard from either of my children. But it was also followed by the inevitable request. "I know things have been bad between us, but I was wondering, now that you have all this money from the settlement, maybe we could start over? I could really use some help with my student loans, and maybe we could—" I hung up before she could finish the sentence. Some people never learn. That summer, I took my trip to Italy. 2 weeks in Tuscany with a small group of travelers, all of us over 60, all of us ready for adventure. We toured vineyards and art museums, took cooking classes and painting workshops, wandered through hill towns that had stood for 1,000 years. In Siena, I painted a watercolor of the cathedral at sunset, the light catching the marble facade in shades of gold and pink. It was the best painting I'd ever done, technically and emotionally. I captured not just the beauty of the building, but the feeling of discovery, of joy found late in life. Standing in that ancient piazza, surrounded by strangers who'd become friends over glasses of Chianti and shared wonder at the beauty around us, I realized something profound. I wasn't alone. I'd chosen solitude, but that was different from loneliness. I'd traded a family that drained my energy and resources for relationships that nourished my soul. When I returned to New York in August, I felt reborn. Tanned and rested, full of stories and new experiences, I looked years younger than I had a year before. Evelyn hugged me at the airport and laughed. "Look at you, world traveler. You're glowing." She was right. I was glowing with the satisfaction of a life finally lived for myself. That fall brought one final test of my resolve. Jake, my other grandson, showed up at my apartment unannounced on a rainy October evening. He was 18 now, Michael's twin but different in temperament. More serious, more like his grandfather Robert had been. "Grandma," he said when I opened the door, "can we talk?" I invited him in and made tea while he sat nervously in my living room, water dripping from his jacket onto my hardwood floors. "I know what my father did," he said without preamble. "Michael told me about the house, about the lawsuit. I know he stole from you." I nodded, waiting to see where this was going. "But he's still my father, and Mom is pregnant." That last bit was news to me. Sarah was pregnant at 38, after years of claiming she never wanted children. "I don't know what you want me to say, Jake. I want to know if you're ever going to forgive them. Because this family is falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it." My heart ached for him. He was trying to carry a burden that wasn't his to bear, trying to solve a problem that had been decades in the making. "Jake, I need you to understand something. I didn't break this family. I didn't create the problems between your father and me, or between your aunt and me. I just stopped being willing to pretend everything was okay when it wasn't. But you could fix it, if you wanted to." "How?" "By being the bigger person, by forgiving and forgetting, by being the grandmother you always were." The grandmother I always was. The grandmother who gave money she couldn't afford and love that was never returned. The grandmother who enabled bad behavior and taught my children that they could treat me poorly without consequences. The grandmother I was made a lot of mistakes, I told him gently. She confused love with money, helping with enabling. "She taught your father that his wants were more important than my needs, and she taught your aunt that someone else would always solve her problems." "But you loved us." "I still love you, all of you. But love without respect isn't healthy for anyone." Jake was quiet for a long time, processing this. Finally, he looked up at me with Robert's earnest eyes. "What would it take? For you to forgive them?" I'd thought about this question many times over the past year. What would reconciliation look like? What would I need to see from David and Sarah to believe they'd truly changed? "A genuine apology," I said. Not an explanation or justification, but an acknowledgement that what they did was wrong. A commitment to treating me like a person instead of a bank account. And time. Trust has to be rebuilt slowly. And if they did all that? I smiled sadly. Then we could start over. But Jake, honestly, I don't think they're capable of it. They've never admitted they were wrong about anything. I don't expect them to start now. After he left, I sat in my comfortable chair looking out at the city lights, thinking about family and forgiveness and the price of self-respect. I wasn't bitter anymore. Anger had been replaced by a kind of peaceful sadness, the way you might feel about a friend who'd moved away and never kept in touch. Winter came early that year. By Thanksgiving, snow covered Central Park like a clean white blanket, erasing the brown decay of autumn. I spent the holiday with Evelyn and Harold and Rita from my painting class, sharing a meal we'd cooked together and stories of things we were grateful for. I was grateful for my small, warm apartment, for friends who valued my company, for grandson who loved me enough to risk their father's anger, for the courage I'd finally found to say no, for the money that gave me choices, for the paintings that gave me joy, for the books that expanded my world, for the Italian phrases I was still learning, for the morning light that streamed through my windows as I drank coffee and planned my day. It wasn't the life I'd imagined at 73, but it was a good life, a life that belonged entirely to me. Christmas brought a surprising gift. Michael and Jake appeared at my door on Christmas Eve, carrying wrapped presents and tentative smiles. "We snuck out," Michael explained. Family dinner got tense. Dad's been drinking and Mom's crying and everyone's mad about everything. "Can we spend Christmas with you instead?" Jake asked. We spent the evening watching old movies and eating Chinese takeout, a tradition I'd started with Robert when we were newlyweds and too poor for a fancy holiday meal. The boys told me about college plans and girlfriends and dreams for their futures. I told them about Italy and my painting classes and the novel I was trying to write. For a few hours, it felt like Christmas used to feel, full of love and laughter and connection. These boys had done nothing to deserve the complicated mess their family had become. They were innocent victims of adult failures and choices. Before they left, I gave them each an envelope. "Don't open it in front of your parents," I said. "It's between us." Inside each envelope was a check for $10,000, their Christmas present and their freedom fund. Money they could use for college expenses or to start their adult lives without having to depend on parents who might use financial support as leverage for control. "Grandma, this is too much," Michael protested. "It's exactly enough," I replied. "You boys are the best thing your father ever did. I want you to have choices." They hugged me goodbye, and I locked the door behind them with a full heart. I might have lost my children, but I hadn't lost everything that mattered. New Year's Eve found me at a small party Evelyn threw in her apartment. A dozen friends from various parts of our lives, former colleagues, neighbors, fellow book club members, people from the hiking group. We played board games and shared champagne and told stories about the year behind us and the year ahead. At midnight, we stood on Evelyn's balcony watching fireworks over the Hudson River, toasting new beginnings and possibilities. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, broken, betrayed, questioning her own worth. That woman seemed like a character from someone else's story. Looking back now, 18 months after the auction that changed everything, I can see clearly what I couldn't understand then. Losing the beach house wasn't the tragedy. Living for decades as someone else's doormat was the tragedy. Being valued only for my ability to solve other people's problems was the tragedy. Accepting cruelty disguised as love was the tragedy. The auction was actually my liberation. It forced me to see the truth about relationships I'd been romanticizing, to confront patterns I'd been enabling, to choose myself for the first time in my adult life. Yes, I lost my house. But I found my backbone. I lost my children's presence in my daily life, but I gained peace and self-respect. I lost the illusion of a loving family, but I discovered I could build a chosen family of friends who value me for who I am rather than what I can provide. The money from the lawsuit sits in investments that will ensure my security for the rest of my life. I've written a will that leaves everything to charities and scholarships, with trust funds for Michael and Jake that their parents can't touch. David and Sarah will get nothing, not out of spite, but because they've proven they can't be trusted with resources they didn't earn. I still paint every Thursday morning with Amy's class. My watercolors have progressed enough that I sold 3 pieces in the group show last month. The money doesn't matter. It was the validation that mattered. The proof that I could create something beautiful and worthwhile. I still take Italian lessons, planning another trip to Italy this summer. I'm thinking about seeing Rome and Venice this time, maybe taking a cooking class in Bologna. I have time and money to travel, to explore, to discover parts of the world I never thought I'd see. I still live in my apartment near the museum, still grow herbs on my balcony, still read voraciously and volunteer with the literacy program. My days are full without being frantic, busy without being overwhelming. I wake up each morning with a sense of anticipation instead of dread. Sometimes I miss the family I thought I had. I miss the grandmother I thought I was. I miss the illusion of unconditional love and belonging. But I don't miss the anxiety that came with never knowing when the next crisis would hit, the resentment that built up from giving more than I received, the exhaustion that came from constantly trying to earn love through financial support. The beach house is still owned by Pete, Miguel, and Tom, though they've defaulted on the mortgage twice and the property is showing signs of neglect. Sometimes I drive out to Montauk just to see it, and I feel nothing but mild curiosity about what they've done with the garden or whether they've fixed the deck. It's just a building now. The memories that mattered, the good ones, I carry with me. The painful ones have finally faded into something manageable. Scar tissue instead of open wounds. David and Sarah have their own lives to live. Sarah had her baby, a daughter named Emma who I'll probably never meet. David's construction business is struggling, probably because word has spread about the lawsuit, and his professional reputation is damaged. They made their choices, and now they live with the consequences. That's not my responsibility anymore. Michael is thriving at Columbia, studying engineering and dating a lovely girl named Jessica who treats him with kindness and respect. Jake chose a state school in California, as far from his parents as he could get while still staying in the country. He's studying environmental science and sending me pictures of the sunset over the Pacific. Both boys call me regularly, and I visit them when I can. We have a relationship now that's based on genuine affection rather than obligation or financial dependence. They see me as a person with her own interests and opinions, not just as a grandmother who exists to serve their needs. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the choice I made to cut off my children rather than continue enabling their behavior. The question always surprises me because it assumes I had a choice to make. I didn't choose to cut them off. I chose to stop allowing myself to be treated poorly, and they chose to respond by cutting me off when I was no longer useful to them. Looking back on everything that's happened, I realize the real tragedy would have been continuing to live as I had been, giving endlessly to people who took endlessly, accepting cruelty as the price of family connection, dying slowly inside while pretending everything was fine. Instead, I chose to live. Really live. For the first time since Robert died. Maybe for the first time ever. The woman who signed away her house in confusion and desperation no longer exists. In her place is someone stronger, wiser, more selfish in the best possible way. Someone who knows her own worth and won't settle for less than respect. Someone who would rather be alone than be taken advantage of. I'm 74 years old now, and I've never been happier. Not because my life is perfect, it isn't, but because it's mine. Every choice I make is based on what I want, what brings me joy, what serves my own interests for once. I answer to no one but myself. Is this selfish? Probably. But after decades of putting everyone else first, I think I've earned the right to some selfishness. I've learned that you can't pour from an empty cup, that you can't love others properly if you don't love yourself. That respect has to be mutual or it isn't really respect at all. If my story sounds familiar to you, if you recognize yourself in the woman I used to be, I want you to know something important. It's never too late to change. It's never too late to say no, to demand better treatment, to choose your own happiness over other people's convenience. You don't have to accept cruelty disguised as love. You don't have to buy affection with money or endure disrespect for the sake of family harmony. You don't have to sacrifice your own well-being to avoid conflict with people who don't value your well-being anyway. The people who truly love you will respect your boundaries. They'll value your happiness. They'll treat you with kindness even when they're not getting something from you in return. If someone only loves you when you're useful to them, that's not love. That's exploitation. It hurts to realize that people you've devoted your life to don't actually care about you as a person. It's devastating to discover that your own children see you as a resource rather than a human being. But once you face that truth, once you stop making excuses for their behavior and start taking care of yourself, you open up space for real love to enter your life. Real love doesn't have to be earned through sacrifice. Real love doesn't come with conditions and demands and threats. Real love rejoices in your happiness instead of trying to profit from your generosity. I found that love in friendships with people like Evelyn and Harold and Rita and Amy. I found it in my relationship with Michael and Jake once I stopped trying to buy their affection and started simply enjoying their company. I found it, finally, in my relationship with myself. The beach house is gone, but I'm still here. Stronger than I've ever been. Happier than I thought possible at this stage of life. Grateful for every day I get to live as myself instead of as someone else's servant. That's not a tragedy. That's a victory. Have you ever watched someone you love sell your dreams out from under you? Have you ever discovered that the people you'd do anything for wouldn't do the smallest thing for you? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this resonates with you, if it gives you hope or courage, or just the comfort of knowing you're not alone, please like this video and subscribe. Sometimes the hardest stories are the ones that set us free, and sharing them helps someone else find their way to freedom too.